My name is Elina Brutschin, and I'm research scholar at IIASA, as mentioned, and the insights that I present today are based on the two papers that you see here on the slides. And just to also non-technical audience to briefly explain what the scenarios and pathways, so basically integrated assessment models, cover the main systems that could be sources or sinks of emissions, and most of the time, three key systems are covered: energy, economy, and land. Through interlinking them, modelers can, for example, tell us something about the CO2 emission trajectories that we could have in the future. And by imposing climate goals or budgets, or carbon budgets, we can learn how emissions could look like. And what was presented today earlier were the two key types of scenarios from the ENGAGE project, where one type, the so-called full century, this is the blue lines that you see on the right panel, don't have basically any major constraints on net negative emissions, and therefore go quite a lot late in the century into the net negative part. And the green scenarios, the key scenarios that we also want to focus on, are the so-called net zero scenarios, which, as you can see in the green line, are constrained and globally do not go net negative. And overall, these are quite ambitious 600 gigaton scenarios where we are quite confident about reaching the 1.5 degree target. And so what are the main structural insights from the scenario? So first of all, as you can see on the green line, we need globally by 2030 almost to have the CO2 emissions and to approach net zero by 2050. And so what can we say about the multidimensional feasibility of this scenario? So one of the key strengths of the ENGAGE project is that natural scientists and social scientists try to work together and to find ways to systematically assess scenarios in terms of their real-world feasibility. And what we can see from integrated assessment models are the variables that they report from these three key systems that I discussed before, so energy, economy, and land. And they report also some of the key indicators. For economy, we could check the carbon price trajectories. For energy, we could check the final energy demand trajectories, and so on. And so this is one of the key elements then that we use to link these scenario values to the real world data. And we followed the IPCC approach also to narrow down the evaluation of scenarios to 5 key dimensions: so geophysical, economic, technological, sociocultural, and institutional. And by consulting the literature and also experts for each dimension, we identified key indicators that we would look into. And to link it again back to the real world, we also try to collect as much evidence as possible based on the literature, on experts' evaluation, and so on. And each scenario went through then evaluation over time and over each dimension. And for each indicator and value, we compared it to real-world data and categorized it into 3 categories. These are called low concern, medium concern, and high concern. And just to give you an example, low concern were values that were more or less in alignment with what we have observed so far, or what was already reported in the literature as feasible. And the overall insight on feasibility is that the major, across all the dimensions, that the major concern that we have is with the institutional capacity. So what does it mean? It means that based on scenario data, many regions which have a relatively low institutional capacity, and this means the ability to provide public goods, where we see, especially already early on, very ambitious scenarios, quite high level of mitigation, and this we haven't observed in the past, and this would really go into this unprecedented levels. But within each dimension, there are certain indicators of major concerns. So for example, within the geophysical dimension, we see biomass as one of the major concerns across many scenarios. So by the end of the century, many scenarios reach relatively high levels of biomass deployment, which raise many sustainability concerns. So what did we learn overall so far? is that there are certain trade-offs, especially across these two types of scenarios, that the net zero budget scenarios, so the green line, require ambitious level of transformation early on, but this helps us to avoid more persistent feasibility concerns later in the century. Again, just to give you a concrete example of what type of trade-offs are we talking about over time and also across technologies. So for example, the net zero green scenarios would require a much faster upscaling of non-biomass renewables in total electricity generation by 2030. So, but then later in the century, do not those scenarios do not rely on, for example, carbon capture and storage technologies, where we also really have the highest level of uncertainty because we don't know whether we will be able to deploy them to such a large scale in the future. And what are we still missing? We have ongoing research within the Engage project, where we try to think more about accounting for regional heterogeneity and involve stakeholders and regional experts and understand better the preferences about these trade-offs. And everyone is also encouraged, if you rewatch this video and would like also to contribute by participating in the survey, to type up this link and submit also your insights on this topic. But generally, so far, for example, from one of the latest stakeholder meetings, we see that for India as a region, for example, stakeholders expect higher levels of CCS to be plausible as compared to scenarios, but are quite concerned about relatively low energy demand compared to their expectations. And interestingly, so far we are also trying to find a way to measure the preferences regarding the trade-offs. And so, for example, there we show stakeholders different setups of scenarios and ask them which scenario they would prefer. And here, so far, we find that, for example, stakeholders generally prefer demand reduction over CCS. But this is really also ongoing work, and the number of responses that we have so far is limited, even though this is, for example, based sort of on experts, on regional experts. And so please also, if you have time, fill out the survey. And thank you very much also for giving me the opportunity to share these insights.